All right, welcome everyone. I see people are still coming into the chat lobby, but we've got a full agenda today, so might as well get started. My name is Griffin Carpenter. I'm an analyst at Transport Environment, focusing on the electrification of the corporate fleet.
The first hour, I'm not speaking.
Okay.
So it's all right, you feel free to speak.
And today we're going to be talking about used battery electric vehicles. I'm very excited by the topic today. I see we've had over 500 people confirmed, so this enthusiasm seems to be shared. According to the most recent data, we're at about 14% of electrification of new cars in Europe, another 9% on top of this for plug-in hybrid electrics. So electrification journey is well underway with the new car market. The used car market, of course, is lagging behind, inevitably so. So for the past few years, there's been questions about this used car market of BEVs. What's the supply? What's the demand? What are the barriers to developing a robust market there? And what policies are being used to address these barriers? So the goal of today's webinar is to see if we can answer some of these questions. And inevitably, we're going to raise some new questions as well. And speaking of questions, if you have any questions during the participants' presentations, at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there is a Q&A box where you can write in some questions. Do not use the chat box, that won't be used for this session. So write your questions in the Q&A. At the end of each session, we'll see how many of those questions we can get to with the panelists. One other bit of admin, this session is being recorded right now, and it will be posted alongside the presentations on the T&E's event page. So you can just Google Transport Environment Events and you should get to the right place. So without further ado, I'll just get into the first session. Our first session is about really the latest data on the used BEV market. So we'll be talking about the volume of cars on the market, their values, their performance. In the second session, we'll be talking about policies. What are the barriers to adoption? What policies are being used? And then finally, we'll have a stakeholder roundtable at the end with a car maker, environmental organization, consumer organization, and a government. So for the first panel, first I'd like to invite Julian de Groot from Dataforce, who will be teaching us about used car volumes for BEVs and where we're at. Julian, if you'd like to take over.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Griffin, for the introduction. So my name is Julian de Groot. I'm the sales and marketing manager for Dataforce. Dataforce is let me quickly tell what we do. We are around 25 years old. We are seated in Frankfurt, and our objective is to bring transparency in the automotive market through market performance, forecasting, and also one of the focus of the last years is to look at the energy transition towards zero emissions and to also look at the CO2 development that is there. And for today, what we did is use basically our forecasting as a tool to make an analysis of what that means for the used car market. So the key question that I would like to go for, and what is the hook for the presentation, is when will be BEVs, or the full electrical vehicles, be the majority of vehicles returning to the market. Now, if we start with that, the first question that is there is like, a car can only become a used vehicle when it's also registered as a new vehicle. So if you look at the chart that we have here, this is basically the actual amount of electrical vehicles that have been registered in EU plus UK plus EFTA for passenger cars. All data sets will have the same scope, more or less, of countries there. And we project that that will go to 5.2 million in 2027. That means that we go from around 13% share for EVs to 35% in those years. This, of course, is a most likely scenario, depending on the amount of incentives taken in the market pool out of the market. This, of course, might change. Also, the amount of charging points will have an influence. This is what we think is the most likely case. Now, if we combine that with the other powertrains that come to market, for instance, or that are on the market, for instance, petrol, here you can see that based on our analysis, that around 27, 28, it's going to be the tipping point to where EV will be the most sold type of powertrain in the European market. And this is important because that means that from that moment on, the EV is sort of the driving factor in the market up to the 100% that has to be in 2035. Now, what if we then look at the new registrations? A new registration will become, of course, a used car registration. So the green line that you see here shows how many cars will come back every year into the used car markets. So in order to make that analysis, we have looked at the different channels where cars are registered. And based on the forecasting that is made the analysis, and that shows that around 4 years is the gap between new registration and cars coming into the used car market. For instance, private customers hold their car longer than for instance, fleet customers. So the higher the amount of private customers, the longer it will take before the cars go into the market. The opposite is also true. There are specific channels like the rental channel and the channel of the manufacturers themselves, the dealers. They tend to have more or less a higher churn. So for rentals, it's about 6 to 12 months. And for registration of dealers and manufacturers, it's usually around 6 months time. So the higher of that portion of the market, the more fresher vehicles will come into the market. And this is something that we will see in the coming years, is that a lot of the cars coming back to the market will be more or less the fleet vehicles in the first run, because they have a runtime of around 3-4 years. Later, you'll see more private cars coming back into the market, and that they with a bit of an older age. So that has an impact also, I guess, on the marketability of the vehicles, but I think the next speaker will go more detail on that. So what we also take into account when we made this analysis, that the holding period during COVID, and also now because of the supply constraint during considering the war in Ukraine, people and companies tend to hold their vehicles longer. So that's also a sort of knock-on effect we see, is that there will be more cars coming back in the market, but the cars that they take then will also come back later in the market again, because they weren't taking them in the first place. Right. If we then compare that, so if we look at the volume here and saying, okay, we expect in 2027 2.2 million vehicles coming back into the market, in the used car market, compared to the other powertrains, we see that it's still not dominant. So it takes a while before really this flow, it will take over the others. So if you look at the petrol one on the top, 7.2 million, that is the dominant powertrain in the market. Hybrids, we still expect them to be quite strong, so they follow more or less the same line as the EVs. This has to do with that a lot of manufacturers are launching hybrids now. Seems to be still a bridging technology for some users. And it will also take a while before all the diesels are out of the market, so this will have an impact too. Now, that doesn't really answer the question, when will EVs be the dominant factor in used car market. So I'll go quickly back to the new registered vehicles. So as I said, there should be a 4-year gap between new registrations and when the cars come back again into the used car market. So from that perspective, given that the tipping point for new registrations is about 27, 28, around 2031, 2032, there you probably will see that the EV will be the most dominant powertrain that will be that will come back to be used by customers. Now, what does that mean in terms of totals? So here I made basically this is a cumulative amount of this is basically the existing park of used EVs that you can see here. Taking into account also certain scrap patch, we might expect some exports out of the European Union, normally speaking. So there is a bit of it's not that will always be less than the amount of new registrations. About now, we can estimate around 1 million used cars for used BEVs in the European market, going up to 6.7 million around in 2027. Now that's a lot of vehicles. However, if you look at the expected total park of used vehicles is around 180 million. So from that perspective, the 6.7 also then is still not that much, and it will take quite a long time before electrical vehicles will really have overtaken other fuel types in the total park. if we go back a step again and we look at the countries, and in this view, I would like to show you what is the moment in time that the influx of EVs into the used car market is the number one powertrain. For Norway, we all know is the market that was the most advanced in adopting electrical vehicles. So there already we can see that this is the number one car coming back also in the used car market. And for that perspective, Norway can also be used as a blueprint, as it was for new car vehicles, to see how the market develops and deals with this influx of cars. Sweden, we expect in 26, 27, Netherlands in 29, and then the bulk of the countries will be in 2030, 2031, to where southern countries like Italy and Spain, we expect that it will take longer for them to come back. And this is also what you will see on the last slide that I will show before we move on, is that if you go to the right side of the slide, you see that for the Netherlands and Belgium, they have almost the same amount of cars coming back into the used car market as for Italy and Spain. And this also might be at some point a bit the case that we could see a vehicle move from the more northern countries to the southern countries, also driven by the fact that something that we researched last year, that we saw that the requirement of Italian and Spanish customers in terms of price is that they want a lower price compared to the northern customers, and their range requirement is lower than northern countries. So they need less charge for one vehicle, which makes it maybe quite an interesting proposition for them to take the used cars out of the northern markets. But of course, that deals also with the fact what the requests and demands are in the used car markets in, for instance, Germany and France. So what happens to the marketability of the vehicles and the residual value. So all this, I think, is more something for the next presenter, Christoph. So with that in mind, I would like to thank you for your time, and I will give back the control to Griffin.
Thanks so much, Julian. We had a couple of questions in the chat, which I think are quick ones just on your presentation. Sure. The label was used hybrid on the graph that was kind of developing alongside BEV for the next couple of years. That's plug-in hybrids, PHEVs, right?
That's both. That's full hybrids and plug-in hybrids combined.
Both together. Okay, good. We clarified that. And also the scope of vehicles. These are passenger cars, not vans or what we might call commercial.
Yes, that's a good point. If I didn't mention it, yes, these are only passenger cars. Yeah, for LCVs, I think we would have a very different analysis going forward. Yeah.
Fair. And actually, we have 1 minute, so one question of my own. There was this kind of tipping point around 2027 for the new car market. Therefore, you're looking at 2031, 32. For when the majority of cars entering the used market will be BEVs. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean you go to a used car platform and the majority of the cars listed there are BEVs, right? There's still this stock flow difference where the market is still characterized by mostly ICE for many years beyond that. Is that right? So it's just the newer used cars, let's say.
I wouldn't say that. What you see now is that the bulk of the volume are driven by fleets that come out. So there's cars 3-4 year old that will get dispersed. The last years there was quite a supply constraint, which meant that the technical channels, as I would like to call them, so the rental and the manufacturer registration, were very low. Now with a more increased supply, that will go up. But so you will see an increase in like relatively fresh vehicles. But there's going to be a point that also the private customers, which are ramping up right now, will get rid of their first cars, and that might be also around that time. So you will get, I think, what you will see, you get more dispersion in the age. So right now it's more or less homogeneous, and that will move away. So you get a bigger spread of the type of vehicles in the market.
Okay, well, that's sooner than I was expecting. Really nice to hear that, Julian. So next up, we'll have Christoph Engelskirchen from Autovista, who will be presenting to us about the value of these vehicles. What are their resale prices that we're observing? Christoph, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Griffin, and thank you, Julian. I hope everyone can hear me all right. So I'm Christoph Engelskirchen from the Autovista Group. I'm the chief economist in that group, and I would like to speak to you a little bit about the adoption of battery electric vehicles on used car markets. We've heard from Julian that it's going to happen, but the question really is, what is the status, in 2023, and yeah, how are the used car markets across Europe looking compared to the new car markets, really? If you want to have a look also at our website, so Autovista24 is our publishing website where you can read up on a lot of the things that I'm going to talk to you today about. There is an article, for example, on the topic from early adopters to mass market, what is in store for used BEVs. It's something, if you didn't catch what I said, it's definitely something you can read up in this article. And yeah, without further ado, I'd like to start with a slide also on the new car market, actually. And it's a slide where the key message is that what we see here in Europe, in terms of battery electric vehicle adoption, is really driven by industrial policy. And one of the greatest example of a very strong industrial policy that is heavily discouraging the use of non-electric vehicles, by the way, is Norway. And that policy has driven adoption up to 80% market share for the battery electric vehicle. And if you look at the numbers, they were at 1% market share in 2011. Yeah, so it took them a little bit more than a decade to move that up to 80%. So strong industrial policy definitely does the trick. On the other hand, if you don't have a strong industrial policy in place, then nobody buys battery electric vehicles for the time being. And the example here is Southern Europe. Obviously, it's also rising, but there we have still a long way to go. 5% market share in Spain, around 4 to 5% in Italy as well. Another aspect here is charging infrastructure. Netherlands, second bullet on the top, has around 60,000 public charging stations and a market share of 30%, versus Germany have charging stations, also half of the market share. So you see a correlation amongst industrial policy and market share. And why is that? I mean, why are people not buying these cars unless they are incentivized to do so? Because there is a bit of a gap in terms of suitability for daily use of these cars. This is on the bottom of the chart. These are average ranges of recently or newly launched battery electric vehicle models. I mean, some of them are not so recent. Yeah. So if you look at, for example, 4 or 5 years ago, that's, by the way, the used car that you're typically seeing on the market. Yeah, you have to live with ranges of around 200, 300 kilometers. And only recently we are starting to hit the 500 kilometer range. There's a bit of a caveat here because those are really, really big, very expensive, large segment cars. So this number might not go up so quickly in the coming years because manufacturers are trying to attract also the mass market with these products. So we need cheaper products, and that probably comes at a lower range as well. So now switching over to the used car market, and again, I'm not trying to spoil the party here and be negative about electric vehicles at all, because it is definitely going to happen. But what we see here is that due to the industrial policy that is in place and was in place, actually what we did do on used car markets is we pushed residual values, prices for internal combustion engine cars up. Those are the top 2 lines here. So blue is petrol, diesel is red. Yeah. So, and this is a price index properly calculated like you would calculate inflation. So we're keeping the basket constant, which is really important because otherwise you're starting to have mixed effects taking over your graphs. So these are really like for like comparison every period. We switch the period every week so that we adjust for, of course, for changes in the market. But this is, and we let this all start at 100. So the numbers here, they don't represent how differently these cars are priced. It just shows you how over the past 3 years, battery electric vehicles, green, weren't able to benefit on used car markets, but ICE vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, in fact, they did benefit a lot from that policy. So let's look at what you actually have to pay now for a used electric vehicle. Let's say you're in Switzerland, you're shopping in the C segment, so you're looking for possibly a Golf, yeah. Or of course, if you're looking for an electric vehicle, maybe an ID3. So you see here a difference between the younger used cars on the top, so 12 months, 20,000 kilometers of range, mileage. And on the bottom, you see 48 months old cars and 80,000 kilometers of total mileage. If you're comparing young electric vehicles with young internal combustion engine vehicles, and this I think is good news, you will be asked to pay the same price. So electric vehicle around 34,000 in that segment on average. Petrol vehicles a little bit higher, 36,000. But as I haven't said this, but this is an average across the C segment. Yeah, so this summarizes everything across brands. So you might have different brands and models and not segments, but models competing here. So these prices are very similar. So we can say that as long as they are young, the used electric vehicles, they are ready to go. They can command similar prices, which is good news actually. Yeah. So we see a shift on used car markets as well. People are becoming a little bit more hesitant, to buy just another used ICE vehicle when they know that the market is switching over. But if you look at the older cars, then electric vehicles cannot compete as well versus internal combustion engine vehicles. And I guess you can answer the question why also for yourself. The reason is that these cars are just not as competitive, in terms of suitability for daily use, aka range, than what we see for petrol and for petrol vehicles. In Switzerland, petrol is performing very strongly, diesel isn't. Yeah, this isn't the case across all of the European countries, so it's a little bit different. But the difference in how well electric vehicles are comparing to other powertrains, depending on age, that is something similar. So that is a pattern that we observe. We will see that gap to close, as soon as the technological advancements are not too extreme, like I showed you on the previous slide. They're quite strong. So once this levels off a little bit, we will see that gap close, in our opinion. Last slide. There is a new, very decisive phase for the battery electric vehicle. And I think many OEMs are quite worried about it. I think consumers shouldn't be worried about it at all, because it's actually quite good for consumers. But when you look at those in the market producing cars, taking risks on these cars, there is a very decisive phase coming up. First of all, we have to acknowledge that innovators and early adopters have been served with electric cars, and the mass market is next. And that means that we need now smaller segments to be populated with battery electric vehicles, which comes at a price and margin challenge. Second bullet here, governments have taken out subsidies across Europe, and list prices will somehow have to give a little bit, because we want electric vehicles to move further up in the market share. But if government incentives are coming out, somebody has to bridge that gap for consumers. And Tesla is one of the brands that was quite decisive and moved first by cutting prices quite substantially. That's going to have an impact on everyone else, of course, as well. And we see quite powerful competition, in my view, coming from China. They've already entered the market, and they're definitely ambitious. The cars are strong, they have good quality, they have good range, and they have an obvious cost advantage in producing, maybe also being supported a little bit from their government. So that's going to trigger volume and price pressure. That is why, and you can read this up on our website a little bit later. I'm not going to go into the numbers too much. That's why we see battery electric vehicles dropping in terms of residual values probably around twice as much as petrol cars. Both will not fall off a cliff, but 2023 is definitely a year where there is a slight downward correction of residual values across all powertrain types. Again, not something to be worried about too much this year because prices have also been rising a lot over the past 3 years. And that would be my presentation, Griffin.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Lots of questions coming in the chat. I'm going to make the judgment call that none of them are quick answers, so we'll save them for the session discussion in about 10 minutes time, but we're taking note of these questions. Next up, I'd like to invite Thomas Hallbrucker from Geotab, who's going to be talking about the performance of BEVs and then therefore used BEVs. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Perfect. Thank you, Griffin. And thanks for the first two presentations. Really good insights into the used car market and data there. So I'm following the used car market in the last few years, and it's been quite a ride, and it makes me excited about what's to come there too. So yeah, today I'm here to talk about the used BEV performance. And when we think about used BEV performance, most people immediately think about, okay, what does it mean regarding the batteries? How does the battery in these battery electric vehicles hold up over the years? And this is understandable. So if you ever had to replace your laptop's battery because it couldn't hold a charge, or you're always looking for a charger because your phone can't stay awake for more than 4 hours, then you would know that yes, batteries do degrade, and battery degradation is a real thing there. So, and the next question is, of course, how does this translate to the electric vehicles? Because we all know that the battery is an important part of those and an expensive part of those. So today I'm here to talk about this one and to give you some good news regarding that. My name is Tamás Hallbrucker. I'm a lead solutions engineer at Geotab in the Nordic, Central, and Eastern European region. And a few words about Geotab that you see also on the slide. We are a leader in the telematics industry for more than 20 years experience there, have more than 3.5 million vehicles overall in the globe connected, all 7 continents, even a few on the Antarctica as well. And from these vehicles, we have a vast amount of data. So more than 55 billion data points every day. It allows us to do analyses that could be used to give you good insights about different topics. Battery degradation would be one of those. Currently, we do support more than 300 EV makes and models where we are able to pick up state of charge, driving energy, charge energy of these vehicles, and then we use this data to do the battery analysis that I will talk about today. But a little bit of background first. Let's start about what battery degradation is, because makes sense to talk a little bit about that. So it is a natural process. It basically means that batteries will lose their capacity to store energy and the ability to accept or give out power over time and over usage there. You likely won't notice the reduction in the power capabilities because most vehicles are not limited by the battery's power capabilities, but rather by software and by the drivetrain. But the energy capacity that is visible on your day-to-day life. So battery degradation is measured in something called state of health. State of health, or SOH, is the ratio between the current energy capacity of the battery and the initial new energy capacity. So if you had a battery which had 60 kilowatt hours of energy capacity when it was new, and today it has 54, then you can say that's a 90% state of health that the battery has now. Since we use batteries in our day-by-day life, there has been lots of scientific research about these batteries, how they degrade, what are the processes that lead to this degradation, and what are the mechanisms in between. And there is like a common understanding about the different factors that affect battery degradation, be that the age of the battery, high temperatures, or even very low temperatures, very high state of charge, very low state of charge operation, or when they are really pushed to their limits, and the amount of usage that these batteries are seeing. These seems to be the common factors. But what we wanted to know is not really how much these methods and these chemical processes are affecting battery degradation, but how these scientific studies translate to the real life and what we can see from those vehicles as a performance side. And using real life data, we wanted to figure out, should drivers or should fleets worry about battery degradation, or is it something that's not that serious as most people will think at the moment? Are there any difference between different makes and models on the market, or they are all created equal there? Is there any correlation, or what's the correlation to those factors that we had earlier? We are sure that there is, but the question is how important each of these would be. And if there is a factor and there is a significant effect on degradation, what can drivers do to reduce the effect of these factors? A little bit of the methodology. So unfortunately, there is no standard data point on electric vehicles that you can just read out this state of health. Some were almost close to all of the OEMs give some kind of data about that one. So you can read out this information from the BMS, but these are not normalized and not standardized, and they are just hard to compare with each other. So instead, what we did is we looked at many charging and discharging cycles of these vehicles and calculated the energy capacity based on that one. So we used more than 6,000 vehicles in this study, overall almost 2 million days of data there, and they were split up to 64 makes and model year categories along 21 models here. What are the results? So this is the good news first. The average degradation is smaller that people thought, and what most common data is. So 2.3% was what we measured over the first few years there, which is lower than what we expected there. And I can give you a quick of a sneak peek. The initial study was done in 2020, and we just did a recent one. And in this recent one, it had a bit fewer mix and models in it, but it includes newer vehicles there. And now we measured only 1.8%. So that means that the trend is even smaller with the newer vehicles there. We also saw that there is difference between the different makes and models there. There is not a huge difference, but there is a difference. So some of them are a bit more prone to degradation, some of them are a bit less, likely connected to their battery chemistries and how those batteries are being tempered versus non-tempered. There is also another piece of good news there is that the high vehicle use doesn't really equal higher battery degradation. That means that we couldn't really see that between a vehicle that's only driving 5,000 kilometers per year versus another one that drives 30,000 or 40,000 kilometers per year, there is no significant difference of battery degradation over the first few years there. So feel free to use those vehicles that you have on the fleet. Where we do see a big difference is actually the climate and the environmental aspects of usage there. So vehicles that are being used by a hotter climate show a bit higher degradation, especially if you combine this with the next point, which is the how those vehicles are being charged. So the more fast charging processes that we saw with the vehicles, on hot climate vehicles, it really speeds up the degradation by a significant factor. So what you see there on this small graph there is an example of this one. Many DC fast charges on a hot climate equals higher degradation than most of those vehicles, or the ones that are being used with less fast charges and with a more moderate climate. What are the key takeaways from this study? One of them would be is that we do really see high levels of sustained battery health. That means it's not as a dangerous thing that most users would think first. So yes, battery degradation is a thing, but the amount that we saw in real life is actually smaller than we thought before. Also, even if this battery degradation is present, and if you are thinking about buying used EVs there, the reduced range of the battery and the reduced range of the vehicle will still likely be enough for your daily ranges. So what we saw on the graph from Christoph there, that the vehicles of today already have a really high average range out there. In 4 years, when these vehicles will be on the used car market, even if their range will be reduced by 10%, you will still have enough or more than enough for day-by-day operation there. So it's really promising from this sense. And also another good thing there is that OEMs and vehicle manufacturers doing their best to reduce the amount of battery degradation and help you operate your vehicles without really affecting the battery lives there. So they are operating with state of charge buffers there. So what you see as 100% on the vehicle is not actually 100%. What you see as 0% is not actually 0%. There are buffers on top and below. And these buffers can be utilized in different ways. So some manufacturers even give some of these buffers free after given periods. So the usable battery capacity remains the same. You don't see any difference over the years of the vehicle until this buffer is used up, basically. And it's still a safe operation there. There are also really good battery thermal management systems out there these days. That means that the vehicle can take care of himself really good by daily operation. Battery preconditioning becoming more and more present in new makes and models. That means that the battery becomes ready for a big charging process there, which helps reduce the effect of degradation. And the lots and lots and lots of improvements in the battery structure and battery chemistry in the last few years there. You might have heard about the new battery chemistries that become mainstream these days, the cobalt-free batteries, LF-free, and so these are more resilient against battery degradation than the traditional nickel metal-based battery chemistries. So there are a few tips that you can do to prolong battery life there. Still, don't keep it on a full charge on a long time. Don't keep it on a really low charge for a long time, and try to reduce the effects of DC fast charging on a hot climate. These are just some good hints going forward. And finally, just a quick slide about how telematics can help with this, because having all these tips and hints, if you are an EV owner, of course, you can take care of it by yourself. If you have fleets if you have EVs in your fleet, then your drivers can also, but it helps a bit to use some system that can help utilize those vehicles, especially if they are used vehicles there, to their utmost capacity. And that will be my last slide of it. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Great, thanks so much, Thomas. Lots of questions coming into the Q&A now. Maybe just a quick clarification question, and then we'll just open it up to the past three presenters and see what we can do with our collective knowledge. So Thomas, you had kind of a battery degradation curve there at the end, and it was quite linear. Do you have any information to kind of confirm that? I think I had seen another study from Recurrent in the US, which had a similar overall average rate of degradation, but more in the first year and then slower afterwards. Do you have anything on that?
Yep.
And then one more point, your graph went out to 48 months, and there was a question in the chat. Do we know anything beyond that, or do we have reasons to expect that after 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, the picture differs?
That's both of them are great questions. So first of all, the degradation chart is not completely linear. So it works like that. In the beginning, you have like a stabilization phase, then it's a bit more steep. Then you have a pretty linear, slow gradient degradation, and at the end it falls down pretty quickly again. So what you see there in this graph is really a bit of the simplification of this initial stabilization and the gradient afterwards. But this initial drop happens really quickly after you start using the battery. So you can actually approximate the first part as a more or less linear over the first few years there. This is why we are showing this kind of data. And it aligns well with other studies, though, if you generalize it over the first few months. And the other question is, of course, right now our study went only back a few years because this is where we had data there, and we are continuing extending on that. So we will see more in the next few years for sure. And we'll have more data and more information about that too.
No, that's great. And actually, do you have a date when your next study is coming out? You mentioned it.
Yep, that one will be coming out in about a month or 1.5. So stay tuned. It will be pretty soon.
Sounds great. Julian, I wonder if I can follow up on something with you. The 4-year kind of lag you're using between the new car market and the used car market, is that similar across fuel types? Can we use kind of an assumption based on ICE models and apply that to BEVs as well?
Yeah, for all of Europe, it might differ per country, these type of things. So I can't answer for everything that's there. It means it's quite difficult. But what we can do, if I look at the German market, so far that it's relatively similar. There are some deviations, but it can depend on the brand mix and the segment of the vehicle, the channel, but it's more or less the same for at this moment in time. Yeah.
Clear. And Julian, one other thing I was wondering about cross-border flows. So sometimes you see news articles that a country with large purchase subsidies will have lots of new BEV registrations, but then maybe they're exported to another country, which maybe undermines some of the national benefits that governments were after. Do we know anything about cross-border flows of used EVs?
That's a really good question. It's I have an example of a dealer which I will not name. In 1 year, he exported all the EVs that he registered after 1 month immediately to another country, which was Norway at the time. 1 year later, because the things changed, he bought them back and sold them again in the same country. So yeah, there are flows. To measure it exactly, it's very hard because you need to track it on a VIN level, and that's almost impossible because that information is usually hidden. So I'll take Germany as an example again. I had a look at that the other day, and of all the vehicles, electric vehicles that have been registered so far, 85% are still in park. That means that 15% of those are out of the German market. And I mean, of course, a few has been scrapped, but given the fact that they're not so old yet, I think a lot of them move away and out of the market. So yeah, they do move. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And 15%, do we have any way of relativizing that compared to ICE vehicles, for example? Is that
for ICE
more,
vehicles,
I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, you don't, the effect is also, you have also imports, right? So you can have export and import. So to the extent when you look at, I think look at diesel the other day, it was around 7 to 8%. So there is this gap. You normally see Germany being more a new car market. A lot of the volumes move anyway, normally through the flow from Western Europe to Eastern Europe, then to Eurasia and Africa as the third destination. So there is this normalized flow where the thing go. Except I think for electrical vehicles, this might so far be limited that this actually happens. There I would think it's more the case that volume moves to where there are or are no incentives. Yeah.
Yeah, as we'd expect, but
yeah.
To be honest, to react, that number is maybe smaller than I would have thought, given at least some press stories. Christoph, a couple questions for you. Someone asked in the chat around the effect of these new car subsidies, maybe sticking with the German example, and whether we see effects from those in the used car market. So if a country increases or decreases its purchase subsidies, what effect does that have?
Yeah, so if they increase the purchase incentive for something on the new car market, it doesn't have an immediate impact on the used car market. Yeah. Then a little bit later, and depending on how the policy is designed, for example, if you get that incentive just for registering something new, and you can immediately sell the car used, that's going to create pressure on used cars because it's just going to create additional volume. If the policy is designed in a way that there's a holding period of maybe 3 years in order to claim or to claim that incentive, then you have an impact in 3 years, right? When these cars are coming back to market. So I mean, to answer your question a little bit differently as well, we see that especially for battery electric vehicles, there is a strong move towards leasing offers. Yeah, so subscription leasing, kind of the same thing, and that will also create more cars being registered as used BEVs in the coming years. So there's a bit of pressure coming in terms of volumes, and also, you know, new competition from let's say New Asia is also going to have more impact on prices as well.
So maybe just to use an example, lots of headlines about Tesla decreasing prices earlier this year on its new BEVs. Did you see anything in the resale values of Teslas? If the new Tesla is becoming more appealing because now it's cheaper, does that steer the market away from used Teslas?
It doesn't steer the market away from used Teslas, but obviously it does have an impact on used car price realization. Yeah, so we see that residual values for Tesla are coming down a little bit. Yeah, and we also see this affecting everyone else. Yeah, but that's a very normal effect of lowering prices, and it's still. If your target is to have lower transaction prices, it's still the better way to do it by simply adjusting the price, the list price, than by offering, you know, huge discounts, because that's just going to create more pressure on residual values. So a straightforward list price deduction. Also, you have to consider prices are up around 20–30% if you compare like on the new car market as well. So maybe it's also time, you know, to reconsider list price positioning, especially for electric vehicles. And also, if government incentives are running out and you need to and you want to sell cars into big European car markets, then you have to do something with a transaction price, and the best way is to adjust the list price rather than offering discounts.
Clear. And maybe just reflecting on one thing, Christoph, in the way your slides overlapping with something Thomas was showing on battery degradation, because I think it was Switzerland, you had as an example where a 12-month-old BEV has a similar performance in its residual value to an ICE. After 48 months, after 4 years, it looked a lot worse. So you could kind of have two theories here. People aren't interested in kind of a 4-year-old BEV because there's new models that are always coming, this kind of life cycle impact. Or do you think there's an underlying skepticism about the performance of these cars after 4 years? Maybe unjustified given what we saw with Thomas, but perceptions are what they are. Do you have any reason to think it's one of those theories versus the other?
Yeah, I wouldn't be so black and white about it. So if you're in the market for a 4-year-old car, you're in the market for a 4-year-old car. So that's what you're getting. And you have to, you can't get a car that was launched last year as a 4-year-old car. It doesn't exist, right? So you're comparing with competitive technology at that level. I showed you a slide previously that cars launched 4 years ago. Oh, sorry, a 4-year-old car could have been launched 8 years ago. Yeah, 8 years ago, the range for that car was maybe 100, maybe 150 kilometers in real life. So you can't expect people to pay, the same, relative value for a car like this if they can get something with 600, 700 kilometers of range given the infrastructure. So that's answer number one. Answer number two, related to that question, if you bought an 8-year-old battery electric vehicle with 160,000 kilometers from anyone, you would not pay, or this car would have lost more percent residual value than a diesel car, because at that point the warranty has run out, and you have to expect that you will have to somehow pay a sum which nobody can tell you. So maybe 10,000, maybe 15,000 for a new battery. So that's going to lower the price of that used car. So I'm talking 8 years now. At 36 months, you don't have that similar effect because OEMs quite rightly have a very, very strong extended warranty policy in place. But it's not a step approach, right? It's not like you're paying until the car is 7 years and 11 months you pay a great price, and then at 8 years, the price drops. It's something that happens gradually over time. So the closer you come to the running out of the warranty, the more the price will drop. And what I'm showing you on the slides is not our opinion, by the way. So these are actual offers that you can also click through depending on the product that you're using. So these are not made up values. So it's these are real prices. And why they are like this, I mean, you can have hypotheses around it, but it doesn't change what we see in the market. Yeah.
Of course, to change those, I think we would need some policy, which is our second session. So I just wanted to thank Thomas, Julian, Christoph for everything you've taught us. There are, I think, 33 questions in the chat, so we didn't get through all of them. For all the speakers, if you do have time and some headspace, maybe you can answer some of them directly. Otherwise, we'll just have to follow up offline. We're doing all we can, but great to see so much interest. So thanks again. So now I'd like to switch over to the policy side of today's webinar. And what we're going to do is have two presentations, one on the barriers to developing a market for used BEVs, and then another on policy solutions. What are governments, what are private institutions trying there, and are they working? So without further delay, I'll turn it over to Lauren Palma from the Green Finance Institute, who will talk to us about some of the barriers. Lauren, over to you.
Thanks very much, Griffin. So thank you for having me speak today and bring sort of UK perspective on some of the barriers facing used EV adoption. According to a survey we did earlier this year of 2,000 UK-based consumers, Almost 3/4 say they would buy an electric vehicle, but only 60% of those people a used electric vehicle. And for those consumers, it's actually never been a better time to make that decision because used prices are down around 18% compared to last year, which means they're more affordable than ever before. Some premium models down by as much as 30%. That's actually really good news for anyone who's looking to buy or finance a used EV, despite the mainstream media's negative headlines about electric car prices plunging, nosediving, or being in freefall. But let me just go back. As we've heard in the previous sessions, the used EV market is growing rapidly on the back of the growing market share of new EVs and the number of new models hitting the market in recent years. The fleet market clearly has been a significant part of those registrations, thanks to low benefit in kind taxation, zero vehicle excise duty, and lower maintenance costs, mean that lower total cost of ownership, and corporate sustainability objectives have driven the switch as well in the UK. Those fleets typically leased on a 3 to 4 year contract before being off-hired to auction houses and sold through the dealer network to retail to consumers as used EVs. Predicting the accurate residual value really matters, therefore, to those finance providers. Too low and the new car monthly price is too high, and that may impact demand. Too high, and then they increase the risk of catalysing losses when the vehicle is sold at the end of contract. That RV setting is as much an art as it is a data science, and that's definitely been the case with EVs, where the historical data hasn't existed in the volumes necessary to reliably estimate RVs. Some may think this is a bit controversial, but from my experience, I think there has been a degree of subjectivity, and residual values can be influenced by RV setters' personal views on the suitability of EVs for their own needs and understanding where demand for a used EV is likely to come from and the own barriers that they face. But looking at where the data is available, estimating RVs is closely linked to supply. And as the supply of vehicles has been increasing, this is expected to put downward pressure on RVs unless the demand is there to mop up that increased supply. And that's been a real concern within the industry for the last couple of years, that the increased supply is going to not be matched by the increase in demand, particularly in the UK, where there's no specific fiscal incentives aimed at used buyers, and therefore result in the RVs not being realised. And to an extent, that is what we're starting to see now. So this time last year, in an effort to try and preempt that supply and demand gap within the UK, the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles, OZEV, set up a number of working groups, each with a focus on a different part of the ecosystem to try and stimulate demand. So that included auction houses and what the auction houses need to do to ensure they're able to prepare for sale and then sell the EVs that come through to dealers. Dealers themselves, are they equipped with the knowledge and the expertise to sell EVs to consumers, particularly the independent network who aren't attached to a manufacturer franchise and might not have access to the same knowledge and training? Repair and maintenance, do we have the repair and maintenance skills and training in place to service these vehicles? And do consumers know that when they do go wrong, there's someone who can fix them? Total cost of ownership and consumer information more widely. So what information are consumers being given at the point of purchase to help them make that informed choice and compare to ICE equivalents? There's a whole myriad of different total cost of ownership calculator tools in existence that probably all give you slightly different answers. Battery health certificates, how they can be standardized and used by dealers looking to source stock and by consumers to give them the confidence to buy. And then the final working group is on finance and data. And actually, is that data around residual values holding back the ability of lenders and lessors to finance used EVs? Each of those working groups are at different stages. And where we started out on finance and data was by surveying consumers, lenders, and dealers to understand what the key barriers were facing the uptake of used EVs. So as I said, around 60% of non-EV drivers would buy an EV as their next car. And of those, 3/4 would consider buying a used EV. That means around 9 million drivers wouldn't. So we asked them then the reasons that they wouldn't go for a used EV compared to a new one or an ICE. And there's really 3 key themes that come out: cost, charging infrastructure, and then specifically to used EVs, concerns around the remaining battery health of used vehicles. Over 60% of people said that battery health concerns was the #1 reason they wouldn't go for a used EV. So this is despite the presence of 8-year warranties and the growing body of data that Thomas just presented that states that batteries are lasting far longer than manufacturers originally expected and losing less range. BMW actually stated yesterday at a conference I was at that their batteries are outlasting the chassis of the cars. But unfortunately, the experience we all have as consumers of our things like iPhones fading rapidly after 2 years of life means that we're wary of car batteries performing the same way. So we think a battery health certificate could really help to overcome that concern. And that's an area that the British Vehicle Rental and Leasing Association in the UK have been coordinating some work on. It is a complex area, I think more complex than was expected, as there's a lot of different ways of estimating battery state of health, as Thomas said earlier. But it's really critical for a number of reasons. When we spoke to lenders and dealers, they both highlighted the value that more data and information on degradation from the OEMs and other sources would have. For lenders, this can help them understand residual values better. See, historically, depreciation curves have been directly related to mileage. In the future, I think, by the sounds of it, they may need to relate to charging behaviours, to the temperature within the country. And for dealers, access to this information also means they can have better conversations with customers about the suitability of the vehicle for their needs. Another key concern of dealers selling used cars under finance is that if it proves to be not fit for purpose because the real world range is less than expected, it can leave them open to claims of mis-selling and claims under the Consumer Credit Act. And as a result of that nervousness, some dealers just aren't selling used electric vehicles yet because they just aren't convinced that their consumers will want them. Almost a third of consumers then said that cost was a key barrier and also cost of maintenance. And again, this despite maintenance costs typically being lower than an ICE. So again, there's a real lack of understanding of total cost of ownership or the cost per mile of driving an electric car versus an ICE. And we need to get better at explaining this concept to consumers and helping them understand how much their vehicles really cost them. As I said, there's a wide range of different calculators out there, but they all work slightly differently, make different assumptions about charging behaviours. And again, this can make it difficult for consumers to trust the information that they're given. And there's also a transition cost in the mind of consumers looking to switch, and that's driven by the cost of installing a home charger. So a fifth of the people we surveyed said that the ability to finance a home charger would help them make the switch, and twice as many would want it included in their monthly finance payments. We know that some finance companies are already doing this, or OEMs give it away for free, particularly with a new vehicle. But to do this in a way which is compliant with the Consumer Credit Act with a simple customer journey is actually quite difficult because of some particular wordings within the Consumer Credit Agreement. And then finally, despite significant acceleration in charging infrastructure, a third of drivers still see access to charging as a barrier, calling for more infrastructure before they make the switch. Often, again, this can be perception rather than reality, particularly for drivers new to EV who think they're going to use the public infrastructure much more than they actually do due to overestimating the distances they drive. Again, that's not really been helped by some media messaging around the lack of chargers compared to targets set by government, which perhaps needs reframing about the right chargers in the right places being used. So just to come back to some numbers, what we're seeing in the used market today. As predicted, we're seeing obviously a significant increase in volumes coming through, and as feared, that consumer demand hasn't ramped up, and that is leading to some downward pressure on prices. Some recent data that Auto Trader shared in the UK gave some really positive news for a used buyer about the upfront price gap between used EV and ICE. The gap's closed significantly, with some electric models now being cheaper than their ICE equivalents at the 3-year-old point. So in particular, a 3-year-old Renault Zoe is cheaper than a Renault Clio. A 3-year-old Jaguar I-Pace is cheaper than the Jaguar F-Pace. And the gap between a 3-year-old BMW 3 Series and a Tesla Model 3 has closed from £22,000 in August last year to just £3,600 last month. So when you then take into account lower maintenance costs and electricity, assuming you can charge at home or locally and aren't reliant on expensive rapid chargers, then actually total cost of ownership for a used EV makes sense. So if we can stimulate demand for used EVs to absorb that increased supply, we should actually start to see values increase again. Perversely, this may then impact demand, causing demand to drop. So those that really find balance to be struck between the setting of residual values to incentivize the sale of new vehicles, which we need to provide the feedstock of used, and setting the values lower, which will widen access to EVs for used buyers. Those supply and demand dynamics are really fragile. They have improved in the last few weeks. It's then compounded by things like moves from Tesla to cut prices, which in the long run will be helpful in widening access, but in the short term just creates nervousness for residual value setters. We then throw into the mix things like over-the-air software updates, which means a used car could be worth more in a few months than it maybe was a few months ago because it's had upgrades to features, to range, to its charging behavior. You can see why residual values are going to be a talking point for a while to come. But fundamentally, we think that things like battery health certificates, more information for consumers, and delivering the charging infrastructure we need can really help to make the difference and democratize EV ownership by improving confidence in the used market and opening up that ownership to a much wider population who may be hesitant today to make the switch. So over back to you, Griffin.
Great. Thanks so much, Lauren. Lots of questions come to my mind, and we'll return to some in the discussion at the end of the session with Sandra as well. I'm wondering, for the UK, it seems like one of the main steering effects is a very aggressive benefit in kind taxation policy. So that's for new cars, and we kind of see the effects on the secondhand market as well. So I'm wondering if you could just help us kind of understand the different groups and kind of the pros and cons of this approach here, because for the used car transaction, there's someone on either side, right? So you're saying comparing the price of a Clio to a Zoe, well, actually you can get a secondhand Zoe for almost the same price as a secondhand Clio. Great for consumers, but is there someone on the other side of that? So like with the UK's policy approach, who do you see as the groups that are primarily the beneficiaries?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge. It's who pays for the price of the vehicle and when. Is it the new car buyer who should bear more of the cost and the depreciation curve? Is it the used car buyer? And how do you manage that through? And I don't know if there's a simple answer to that, but certainly benefit in kind legislation has really helped the uptake of new EVs. And without that uptake of new EVs, there would be no used EV. So it's been a really powerful tool to incentivize fleets who are churning those vehicles every 3 years and putting that into the car market. I think perversely what it's done though also is encourage a switch to more premium vehicles. So when you were paying 0% benefit in kind a couple of years ago, it meant you could afford a £60,000 car actually, because you were paying no tax on that. Previously you might have been in a £30,000, I don't know, Vauxhall something or other. Suddenly for the same price, you could double the value of your car and switch into a premium model. And that's led to sort of behavioral expectation, I think, of some company car drivers now, which is going to be difficult to reverse.
Yes, this issue of do we have the right, quote unquote, right used BEVs entering the market is something we'll definitely return to for the roundtable. Maybe one more question before we turn it over to Sandra. You mentioned that in some cases the BEVs are outlasting the chassis and the battery is outlasting the chassis. BMW, you mentioned, sounded confident in the lifetime of their vehicles. Why isn't there more being done on the warranty front, for example? If we're kind of getting all these positive results, are there other products that can be offered from the OEM side?
Yeah, I think we'll start to see, the insurance industry and others offering extended warranties if we get access to the data that proves that the batteries are outlasting the vehicles. I think at the moment, till I've seen some of that data from Thomas, there isn't a lot of data around there, or it's not particularly widely publicized. The OEMs, I think, treat some of that information as quite commercially sensitive and perhaps aren't that willing to share the data. So I think it's around actually lack of data, and although we're starting to see it, it's probably not in the volumes that are maybe statistically significant enough for people to really start to have the confidence to offer new financial warranties in that way. But I think they'll come.
Yeah, maybe after this webinar. So we'll turn it over to Sandra now, who's going to be talking about some of the policies, especially that governments are putting in place in this area.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Welcome, everybody. My name is Sandra Wappelos, working for the International Council on Clean Transportation. And today I'm looking at policy approaches available to spur the used BEV market. Next slide. Yeah, we heard before the new electric vehicle market is growing here. Figure from the global EV outlook, and will take like 4 or 5 years until these vehicles are coming to or entering the used car market. So there is a great chance that key barriers like vehicle costs, that this can be debunked, that more used vehicles or more affordable vehicles are coming to the market to the benefit of a larger consumer group. Next slide. And before I talk about policies, I think it's important to understand who are we talking about, who are the users of new and used vehicles, or who is buying these vehicles. And on the left side, it's for Germany for 2022, the average yearly net household income of new car buyers, and on the bottom of used car buyers. And we can see that new car buyers earn significantly more than the German average. And for used car buyers, it's about the German average. And so income plays an important role. And next slide. And so the idea to have the used car market and to address a larger consumer group who are able to afford a used vehicle and are not able to afford a new vehicle. We are talking about a different consumer group here, and we need to gain a better understanding who are the used vehicle buyers. And I've here again a slide or a figure for Germany, new and used car buyers and what they are spending. And so at least in Germany, new car buyers spend double the amount on a new car than used car buyers. And we saw before used car buyers typically earn on average significantly less than new car buyers. And this has also implications when we think about policies. And when we talk about households with lower income, hoping they will be able to buy used battery electric vehicles because they are cheaper than new ones. In general, they buy less expensive vehicles. Typically, they own fewer vehicles. They drive less kilometers per year. That has also implications on being interested when we talk about battery range in used battery electric vehicles. They're more likely to live in multi-family homes and detached houses, and are less likely to own a garage. That has also implications for charging. That refers to new BEVs, but also when thinking about entering the used car market and addressing a larger consumer group who might be interested but still need to charge a vehicle. Next slide, please. This is a figure from a study from the Netherlands. I think that is also showing that here we see electric vehicle drivers in the Netherlands. New is the green and used is the blue, and depending on income. And what we can see here that still most new vehicle, used vehicle drivers in the Netherlands, also very far developed EV market, earn above average. And this is not a surprise. People with lower incomes or below average incomes own less vehicles. We have a higher share compared to new vehicles or drivers of BEVs, of new BEVs compared to used. But still, we still see it's, when we talk about the consumer group and also thinking about policies, we are still having a large amount, a large share of the population with higher incomes also buying used battery electric vehicles. Next slide. And so there are further barriers. We talked about that, charging availability, and here again for Germany, and that's all new car buyers, independent of the fuel type, and used car buyers, and where can they park their vehicle. And we see that used car buyers to 39% park their vehicle on public street, so they cannot charge their vehicle at home. So this amount, people owning a garage or can park their vehicle in an underground car park, is much higher, 67% for new car buyers. So the potential to charge at home is much higher for new car buyers. So this is just a bit of background to get an understanding what kind of policies are necessary when we talk about the used BEV market. Next slide. I'm listing here a few policies that's based on a study on the used BEV market we published about a year ago. And so there are different policies to support the used battery electric vehicle market. I'm starting in the middle, purchasing support to make BEVs less costly than conventional vehicles, like providing incentives, also making them based on income. As we have seen, it's not necessarily that now lower income are buying used battery electric vehicles. It's also, there's a need for charging infrastructure or home charging, but also public charging in areas like low income areas or rural areas. Awareness and education, this is also what has been addressed before, is an important subject. And other topics about battery durability, like assurance provisions, about what are the actual costs, what is the battery lifetime, what are the costs about repair, maintenance. There's also action needed and to generate a better understanding and raise awareness. I will focus on a couple of policies on purchasing support. Next slide. So different incentives, and that was also addressed, that even the prices might be lower, that still, compared to new BEVs, there still might need to be incentives for the purchase or lease of a used battery electric vehicle. And like countries like France, Germany, and Netherlands, they are providing purchase incentives for used cars. I don't want to go into detail. They're not really comparable. They differ by beneficiaries, the holding period, and the preconditions to receive a grant for a used BEV. But what I show on the left side is always about, also the question is about what are the successes of the different schemes. And I'm showing in this figure the subsidies that have been paid by the Dutch government for used BEVs. That's the dark blue columns, and new BEVs. So there was a limit, and the success story is certainly that the funds have been used up before the end of the year. So you can see that there's interest in buying new BEVs, but also used BEVs, which is a good sign, and also the success of the program. Next slide. And some governments, not in Europe, it's largely in the United States, they make these incentives dependent on income. When we recall the slide and the figure for the Netherlands, who is driving used and new BEVs, it should be avoided that the incentives, again, as for the new vehicles, are to the benefit largely of the higher income people. And so with incentives for income-based incentives, also for used vehicle purchases or used BEV purchases, we can address particularly this group. It's not only about incentives, it's also about information. But for example, here in California, the Clean Vehicle System program that offers up to 7,000 euros for the purchase of a vehicle. New and used vehicles, electric vehicles are being subsidized, and also home charging facilities. And this is with focus on low-income households or people living in disadvantaged communities. And the figure on the left shows the clean vehicle grant. So the grant started 2018, and it shows the gross annual income of the grantees on the left for new BEVs, on the right for used BEVs. And we can see that particularly in the lower income groups, there's a high share of people who did receive the grant. So this is also a good sign and shows that there is also interest for this group, and also when we think about addressing a larger consumer group beyond the early adopters, also for the used BEV market. And there's also a website and a dashboard where you can find all kinds of information about the results and the effects of this program. And as the next slide, this is additional policy. So this is not only focused on the used BEV market, but I think it's still worth mentioning. France, they are planning so-called social leasing program. I think that was addressed before, that this is also a way to help those who cannot afford a new car and go beyond the early adopters to finance a vehicle. It's not being started yet. There are not too many details out there yet, so I cannot say anything about the successes, but this is certainly an interesting program. Another aspect is car sharing in disadvantaged or lower middle income communities for those who cannot afford a new vehicle or a used vehicle even. There are some programs in some cities in California particularly, where they offer discounted rates and membership rates and trip costs for people in lower or middle incomes. It is also the same, the effects. There's not that much information because most of these programs are in a pilot stage. There's not so much information out there yet about the effects. And last slide. So to conclude, so the used BEV market offers a great opportunity to expand access to BEVs for a greater population. But this market is still in its early stages, and it's important to understand the users, the needs, and to think about what kind of incentives are needed, charging infrastructure, what kind of information to really make targeted policy recommendation, because the used BEV market and also the users or the potential consumers are different to the new BEV buyers and drivers. So that's, thank you.
Thanks so much, Sandra. I have a quick clarification question, and then we'll open to more general questions. And I see some coming in the chat. So about the used BEV subsidies, I think this is one of the clearest policies to understand, one that has a lot of interest. Just to be as clear as possible, this means that a BEV could be subsidized multiple times. It might have a grant of 5,000 euros when it's purchased, and 4 years later, there might be an additional used BEV subsidy, which is a bit different than maybe a program is introduced in 2022, which means a car that entered the market in 2020 never got that first subsidy. So which are we talking about here?
So the programs work very different. So I didn't go into detail. So for example, in Germany, you only get the subsidy if you have not received a subsidy for a new BEV before. I mean, for this particular vehicle you're buying. Other countries, you have to own, I think in France, it's at least 3 years until you get the next grant. So the eligibility criteria are very different. So the idea is that, you know, it's also, you have to buy the used vehicle at the car dealership. It's not that you exchange with your neighbor the vehicle every other month and benefit from a purchase incentive. So again, there are different in the three countries where I know that they have used BEV incentives.
Okay, and it might be the same answer, but there's a question in the chat around eligibility for used EVs in scrappage schemes. So I think generally, at least the way these schemes are thought of in their objectives, it's usually about getting new BEVs in exchange for an old ICE car, retiring that from the fleet. Are used BEVs eligible, or is the answer again, depends by country and design?
I think in France, it's also eligible for used. I would need to look it up. I never bring that up. So France has a scheme, it's income-based, their scrappage scheme. But the new vehicle can also be a low emission vehicle, doesn't necessarily have to be an EV. So
right. Okay, so in terms of a more general question, and Lauren, I think maybe you looked into this, but I was wondering about policies beyond just government fiscal policies, but about what private actors and institutions can be doing. So clearly a lot of used vehicles are purchased through online platforms, not just used car dealerships. Is there something these platforms can be doing? I know, Lauren, you talked about TCO. Is that being displayed? Should it be? Can it be? How about other attributes people might be looking for in BEVs? If you want a certain range, if you want a certain battery size, can you find that on these platforms easily?
I think absolutely. In the absence of fiscal policy, there's certainly a number of things private actors can do, and online retailers and dealerships themselves can, I think, do more to display information to consumers, because it's online and it's in dealers that consumers are going to find out about these cars and whether they're suitable. And I think that can include total cost of ownership and sort of calculators like that. I think also that's somewhere you would display a battery health certificate, which I do think is probably the one thing that would make the biggest difference in addition to cost. I think that is the one thing that would make the biggest difference to consumers being willing to buy a used EV. And I think being able to search on things like range and on suitability for people's needs is also quite critical. So at the moment, a lot of the search engines are still based on price or list price or maybe monthly payment, not necessarily based on total cost of ownership or on range of the vehicle. It's more about engine size, which is irrelevant to a BEV.
And maybe one for Sandra as well. To what extent are the different policies we've discussed here complements or substitutes? So France seems to have a social leasing program they're looking at. They also have subsidies for first-hand buyers, for second-hand buyers, with other policies in place. Is it kind of like we need 10 different policies at once, or to what extent are these substitutes?
So in France, these grants or subsidies can be combined, but that is depends on the country. So in France, we have a very strong focus on the social aspect. They also introduced an income-based purchase incentive for new BEV purchases. It's the first country I know of in Europe, so it's more common in the United States or North America. And so this is, they have a very much a social focus to increase ownership across different consumer groups, and also increase access for lower, middle, moderate income households. They are complemented from my understanding.
Great. And just because we're running out of time here, maybe for both of you, from the barriers you've looked at and the policies, does any one jump out if you have to make kind of a recommendation here? How do we prioritize these things?
I think in the UK, one of the other challenges actually is around the difference between the VAT rate on public charging versus home charging. So it's essentially sort of a tax on those who don't have access to charging at home. So you're paying 20% VAT on public charging and 5% on your electricity at home. So I think aligning those two things would go a long way to reducing the cost of charging for used EV drivers, many of whom are less likely to have access to their own parking because they tend to be lower income, therefore living in flats or on streets.
Sandra, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that also as for the new market, also for the used BEV market, its cost is still a huge barrier, charging infrastructure and information. And I think particularly for the used BEV market, when we talk about resale values, battery dependency, and other aspects, it's even more important to inform and think about targeted policies.
Great. Well, we'll certainly talk more about that in the next session. Thank you both, Sandra and Lauren. And I must say, Thomas and Christoph are really setting an example of responding to all the questions in the Q&A. So if there's any there that are directed to you and you think you can answer, by all means, that would be fantastic. So for the final session, we're going to have a roundtable discussion with different perspectives being offered, or perhaps aligned perspectives. So we'll be hearing from a car maker, we'll be hearing from a government perspective, consumer group, and environmental group. So I'm pleased that we have with us Suzanne Rietsma from the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, Julia Poskanova, also from Transport Environment, like me, and Robin Los from the European Consumer Organization. And shortly we'll be joined by Owen Griffiths from Volvo Cars. So everyone, I hope you've enjoyed the discussion so far. I thought we'd start just by going around kind of 2-minute reaction, maybe introduce your organization, your perspective on the issue, and reacting to anything you've heard in the presentations that maybe was a surprise. Maybe I'll start Susan Rietsma from Netherlands Enterprise Agency.
Yeah, well, thanks. The Netherlands Enterprise Agency is part of the Dutch government, so that's why I'm here from the government. I've worked there for several years in the team of sustainable mobility with a focus on e-mobility. So when we started, we were happy with converted cars, electric, and then we were very happy with the electric vehicles coming from the manufacturing directly. But right now we're focusing on used cars, and that's very much because we want to let a group that can benefit the energy transition grow towards people with lower budgets. So that's all a good cause, and I'm afraid we are the ones buying the electric vehicles from Germany in the Netherlands. So we import more electric vehicles, used electric vehicles, than we export them. So that makes people in the Netherlands very happy. And I also heard a lot of topics that are relevant to us as well, like a total cost of ownership. I didn't hear car sharing yet, but we're on to that as well. So maybe we can talk about that as well.
Great. I'll be sure to bring that up again. I think we'll have some agreement on that point on the panel. Robin Los, can I turn it over to you at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Griffin. Nice to meet you all and nice to see you. So I'm Robin Los. I'm the Senior Sustainable Transport Officer for BEVs, the European Consumer Organization. As you can imagine, today's event was kind of music to my ears, because used BEVs is what we've been calling for as soon to arrive on the EU market as soon as possible. At BEVs, we worked quite a lot on the price of electric vehicles, and especially on this TCO, this total cost of ownership, which is still something that many consumers can't grasp, but that can really make a difference. And of course, we very much favor electrifications as it can bring clear benefits. And as I said, especially on the used market, which is the majority of consumers buying cars. So everything I've just heard is super interesting, and to share a bit some more pessimistic insight, let's say, on this. I think what this story about electrification of passenger cars tells us is that we need to also rethink our way of seeing and buying and using cars. I'd say we need 3 things, right? We need new cars. So we need electric cars, we need small electric cars that will bring us confidence in the electrification pathway, right? We also need a new usage. And there we touch upon the battery durability. We need to have confidence. Consumers need to have confidence that the battery will not degrade so much that it will be like an iPhone. And we need new financial schemes to buy these cars, to use these cars. Because of course, and that's probably the sad part of the story, is that we need new financing scheme for all cars, because all car prices are going up and people won't be able to afford them. Even like petrol cars that we don't want people to buy very soon are getting so expensive that the whole storytelling about car usage, it has to be redefined. We need better use of cars, less use of cars, other alternatives to be there. But I think everything we touched upon today is kind of answering these questions that will bring what is missing at the moment, is the confidence on the market. But indeed, we have plenty of solutions in terms of financing schemes, in terms of deploying more charge points at home, incentivizing people to have charge points at home, at their workplace. And also, of course, new legislative tools that can be put in place in terms of by building this confidence on the state of health of batteries, on the durability mechanism. We have the solutions, but now if we rethink the process, we can really push them forward so that everyone, even before 2031, can find a used BEV that would fit their needs. That's what I would say.
Great. We'll certainly be following up on that point and the policies that could speed up that flow. Julia, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Griffin. So Julia, I'm Senior Director with Transport and Environment, looking at all things policy and measures to really accelerate electric vehicles and supply chains more generally. I would say it's been a really fascinating discussion so far. I've genuinely learned a lot, so thanks for sharing all these insights. The two things that stood out to me was, number one, the fact that, as we of course all know, there is huge demand for affordable battery electric vehicles, second-hand cars, but the demand will be somewhat constrained in the coming years. So yes, it is increasing, but up until pretty much 2030, it's on the current measures constrained. And I think that's why, for me, there is a real need and focus to actually have measures to accelerate the supply of these vehicles into the market, into the first market. So we need to double down our efforts on fleet electrification, corporate electrification, so there's more volume of these vehicles. But it's also not enough on its own. And I think we need to have other targeted solutions on affordable BEV. Be it retrofitting your old cars, EV conversion is really growing in popularity, or things like low-cost leasing and smaller vehicles simply designed for the market. The second maybe insight to highlight that came as a surprise to me, because mostly I'm with geeks who all talk about batteries, and every geek knows, and Lauren mentioned that I was at the same conference as well, every car maker will tell you that batteries outlast electric vehicles today, right? We are not just talking about second life of batteries, which actually power stadiums already in Europe. We're talking about third and fourth life. And yet people on the ground who want to buy these vehicles are not aware, and there is this lack of knowledge and that concern. So I think that's a core barrier that is really important to address, and that idea of a state of health certificate very much resonated with me as one of the simple solutions.
Yeah, I think that's coming through loud and clear. I just want to welcome Owen Griffiths from Volvo Cars to the panel. So Owen, thank you for joining us. I know you had a conflict just before. So at the moment, we're just going around kind of introducing the organization, perspective on used electric vehicles, and what are the main dimensions to that issue that you're interested in discussing. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. And I'm really sorry that I had a bit of a technical issue, and I'm actually on my phone, so that's not perfect, but I'll do my best. Yeah, so I think we all know Volvo Cars and the ambition that we have to lead on sustainability, and being one of the first to sort of set the ambition to be an all-electric vehicle is obviously something that we've been very proud of. But yeah, now it comes down to the real brass tacks of this and making it happen. My role as head of circular economy is not just about the production of the vehicles and reducing carbon footprint and the biodiversity impact. It's also about the whole life cycle of the vehicles. So when we talk about reuse and the life cycle of the vehicles, I think is absolutely critical. And I was just catching the end of what Julia was talking about there, and the fact that these vehicles the batteries are going to last a long time, and at the end of life, the vehicles are worth a good amount of money because of the materials that are inside there. So I think it's really important that we do really try and encourage sort of the uptake and the retention of the residual value throughout the life of the vehicles. But yeah, I'm more than happy to be here and answer some questions. And I should just make it clear that I'm not a fleet expert. So if there are questions that come up that are quite specific, I'll be more than happy to revert back to the commercial team and come back with a bit more information later.
Great, much appreciated, Owen. So maybe I'll just ask one directed question to each person, and then some general questions anyone can answer as they feel inspired. So Susan, it was interesting to see in Sandra's presentation that a couple of policies from the Dutch government came up there on used BEV support. Not super common policies in Europe supporting purchase grants for secondhand EVs. I was wondering if you could explain to your understanding what kind of the motivation behind that policy was in the Netherlands. Where did the idea come from? How did you decide to get political support to pass this kind of purchase grant?
Yeah, well, we started with subsidizing the new electric vehicles. And once we did that, we got some comments like we are subsidizing Prosecco slurping Tesla drivers, which wasn't true because we had a limit to the price of the car in the subsidy scheme. So higher cars, they don't even apply for subsidy, but it was still the common thought in the Netherlands a little bit. It depends also on the political arrangements in the country at the right moment and how the flow is going. But we thought we have to move on to a next group. We have to make the energy transition more applicable for larger groups of consumers. I saw in a previous presentation that for second-hand cars, people in Germany spent about 20,000 euros, maybe a little bit less, but in the Netherlands, we hear from a lot of people they want to spend 10,000 euros, and that's it for a second-hand car. So then we had to do something to make that possible. It was also a way to keep the already subsidized cars in the Netherlands. And I mean subsidized by real subsidy scheme and also by tax benefits. So the Tesla cars did use the tax benefits in the earlier years from leasing cars. And so otherwise we would have seen lots of exports of those vehicles. And meanwhile, a lot of people who want to buy an electric vehicle but don't have the right amount of money. So that's why we started it.
Yeah, I find that really interesting that I guess so much policies at the EU level, but fiscal policies are still national. So if you want to keep the cars in the country, this is one of the tools you have to do so. I found that, yeah, kind of a surprising objective, but it makes sense. It's really interesting. Robin, I wanted to ask about some of the work BEUC has been doing on total cost of ownership. I know you've had some studies with Element Energy on this, so maybe you can just share with us kind of the top lines you learned from those TCO studies.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, I'll take the questions you asked, Suzanne, because I think it's an interesting finding that we had during these total cost of ownership studies. What we did is looked at the price of electric cars in several countries, several use cases. But we also wanted to look into the ways of subsidizing electric vehicles. And one of the very most interesting findings that we had is that electric vehicles are somehow the most equitable powertrain in Europe, because the first user pays more of the lifetime value of the car compared to a first buyer of a petrol or diesel car. So you put the burden on the shoulders of people who can actually buy new cars, which is not the majority of people in Europe. But even if you apply a subsidy there, the first buyers still have the greater share of the total value of the car. So basically, you're helping down the road people in the second-hand and third-hand market. Now, of course, we can criticize these subsidies as a gift to the people who can actually buy cars. We've seen that some car makers are actually playing with the level or the limit for the bonus to apply. But still, it is not something to throw away completely because it actually serves the market. But as I said, for us, the most important part is on used cars because that's the majority of consumers in Europe. And there we show that if they were there, every European consumer who would like to buy a second-hand BEV would be better off if he actually could find it compared to a used petrol or diesel car. But of course, we know that this takes time, but that's an interesting finding. It means that we really need to accelerate the first-hand market. And there, if I just can make a quick point on the financing schemes, we still need to tackle this upfront cost barrier. We still need to find ways to make cars affordable. There are some interesting developments on the social leasing, on 0% credits that could be awarded for some specific consumers. I think these are the new priorities for governments now, and this is where we should go for. And a last point on the price, because it's still related to total cost of ownership, is the charging element. It's still a bottleneck. Finding the chargers, definitely, but knowing the price and having a fair price of the charging. We see some worrying developments there on price being not so transparent, varying way too much. And I think there's also an action that could be of interest for policymakers.
So can I just clarify something from my own understanding, Robin, on the total cost of ownership point? We see a lot of studies where total cost of ownership is compared kind of from the point of purchase to some sort of 10 years of use or so. And in general, BEVs perform pretty well on that, at least better than purchase price alone. Is it the case then, from what I hear you saying, that the total cost of ownership would be even better for a used BEV, a 4-year-old used BEV compared to a 4-year-old petrol? So kind of best case scenario from a TCO perspective would be a used BEV. Is that fair?
Indeed. So what we did is we looked in 9 different EU countries. So taking into account the subsidies you might have in France, Germany, but also looking at markets like Slovenia, Lithuania. And even there, in those markets, as soon as you pass the first owner stage, buying a second-hand BEV, and you're better off than the equivalent petrol or diesel car. So it's a matter of making it available, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Clear. And we will.
I'm happy to share the result of this study to whoever has not seen it yet, which is a shame, by the way, but happy to share it.
Great stuff. Julia, I was wondering about the environmental dimension here. I think we're used to hearing the argument now about the need to shift production from ICE to BEVs to lower life cycle emissions. But of course, once the car is produced, it's saving emissions each year that it's used. So what's the kind of used car dimension on this? To what extent are we curious about ownership and who's driving the car, or is it just the fact that the BEVs exist? Is that the only environmental dimension?
Yes, thanks, Griffin. Before I answer your question, I'd like to take a step back and actually clearly, because it was quite in a discussion today, say that when we look at the environmental footprint of battery electric vehicles, I hope everyone here today is clear it's already significantly better than average diesel or petrol car. But that footprint depends on the size of the vehicle. And what vehicles enter the mainstream market depends on the leasing market, depends on what cars is going into the corporate channel, because it's almost pretty much sometimes 2/3 of all vehicles sold, right? So it's interesting to hear that because of some incentives, some people in the corporate segment are almost encouraged to go up market and buy a bigger vehicle. Similarly, car makers are encouraged to sell those bigger premium vehicles because they have really healthy profit margins. But the question is that large vehicle the right vehicle for the entire lifetime of that vehicle, for second-hand users, for third-hand users, for the utility that will be there beyond maybe 2 first exciting years for that executive to drive it? And the answer is no. So we need to instill the right sizing of vehicles from the very beginning into this market, and we need to incentivize the right sized vehicles also into the corporate market, because that determines not just the environmental impact, but the affordability of that vehicle throughout its lifetime. And that's quite important. But to answer your question, of course, from the perspective of the climate, what matters is to reduce fossil kilometers driven by the car as fast as possible and as quickly and at scale, right, as possible. So you want as many electric vehicles and them in the first instance to displace those that drive the longest. That's why electrifying corporate channel makes so much sense. It's simply we are, from the CO2 perspective, displacing those fossil kilometers faster. Then how and who drives this in the second-hand market? Well, of course, depends. If you can be, for example, an Uber driver. So, and Uber drivers sometimes do go for second-hand vehicles, and it makes sense to prioritize it there. But generally, when we are in the second-hand market, it's more a matter actually of social policy and equity, right? It's about people having access to those vehicles, so they're part of this transition rather than environmental aspects of it. I would argue that getting those vehicles to those, democratizing electric vehicles to low-income households is important because it creates bigger political buy-in. And in a roundabout way, the political buy-in gives politicians power to go more ambitiously on environment. So we go back to ability actually to be more environmentally ambitious if there's just more of these affordable vehicles on the second-hand market.
Clear, and I think you've raised a challenge for Owen, so maybe I'll just direct Julia's comments towards you. Owen, so how's Volvo thinking about these questions about right sizing? I know you're working on circular economy, of course, so what kind of vehicles are being produced and why?
Well, yeah, and it's a really good question, and I support that. I think every time we talk about the sustainability impact that we do most commonly talk about the climate issue, I think it is also important to talk about the biodiversity issue. So to your point, I support and I understand where you're coming from, but I think it's really important that we look at both of those aspects because we recognise that the impact that the electric vehicles have is also negative towards the biodiversity space as well. So that's one thing. The second thing is, but democratizing electric vehicles is exactly a really good question. I think one of the challenges that I think we face here is about whether we are putting products onto the market or trying to provide mobility. And for certain groups of people, would it be better to create mobility solutions in certain environments where we could actually have shared mobility or provide peer-to-peer sharing solutions? Where the EX90 that's coming out is going to be the first vehicle that has standard vehicle to grid charging, which means that there's a potential to sort of subsidize some energy costs by storing energy in your vehicle, and that's being your home battery. And so I think it's absolutely fair to suggest that we should think about the way to ensure that electric vehicles are shared across a wider group of the social or the social sphere, but we should also think about ways in which we consider mobility and sharing new business models across the value chain as well. And to that point as well, I think it's important that we talk about the accessibility and the pricing. But I also think it's really important that we talk about the right pricing. Absolutely, when a vehicle is driven an incredibly long way, even though that we saw earlier today that the usage, passenger kilometers delivered, it doesn't have so much impact on the battery. It is important to think about the actual value of the vehicle and the state of health of the battery. So the better that we can provide a true value to the vehicle to the next customer, the better. So whether that is a higher price because the vehicle's been dealt with better, or a lower price because it's not, I think that's really important. And product passports and state of health applications are going to be helpful there to try and be more transparent and more honest. And the final part to that sort of the value retention piece is we have this idea that the total cost of ownership goes to 10 years, as you rightly point out, or residual value peters off and gets to barely nothing after 5, 10, 8, whatever number of years it is. We have to reconsider that. The value of a vehicle is there all the way through to the end of life. You're driving around in high value material that we're trying to incentivize recirculation of through dismantling and recycling in more efficient processes. So this idea that we basically depreciate from day 1 to 8 years, and the value of an end-of-life vehicle is 0 is not the case anymore. We have a value in that vehicle, and that needs to be taken into consideration. And now I've had that little rant on my pedestal about those things. Maybe I'll directly respond to you about the right sizing. Obviously, I'm coming into this room as a company that's recognised as putting big vehicles onto the market. So I won't beat around that bush. I'll take that head on. But we're about to launch a smaller vehicle. I think it came out the other day that it's called the EX30. And so you will recognize that we are starting to take this very, very seriously. But it is very difficult to, coming from a sustainability background, to come into an organization like Volvo Cars that is it has a legacy of designing vehicles for increasing profitability, and balancing increased profitability and revenue generation with sustainability is a complex one, especially for any business that is on the market. So let's be honest here, it's the right way to go from a sustainability perspective, but many linear businesses are challenged to balance that continued profit generation while we transition from this ICE hybrid and BEV market to a BEV market, and businesses have to balance that carefully. So that's a reflection on that point. But there is a release coming soon, which should give a bit more clarity on that point.
Yes, thanks for that update. Very exciting. Yeah, be interested to see the stats on the vehicle. So there's one question that's come up in the chat. Maybe Suzanne, I'll turn this over to you, but it's about the fact that especially these fiscal policy levers vary so much between countries in Europe. So I guess there's a challenge there in having a kind of EU-wide. I think that they've used the word solidarity in the question. So from where you're sitting, Suzanne, do you network with the other governments on subsidies? How much communication is there between you? And how much concern or how much weight do you give that towards the effects that your policies might have on neighboring countries in Europe?
Yeah, we do consult other countries. There are, well, sometimes overviews of subsidy schemes in countries with all the benefits and measurements taken. So that's common knowledge, and we do discuss it with other countries. But until the targets EU-wide will get into action, so 2035, of course, is the most important date for that, then it's up to the country to decide. And I think it's the political situation in your country, is very much leading to what is possible, what not. Yeah, so I think towards 2035 we will be on the same level, but till then it's more like you have your own climate target goals, and you have to do your utmost best to get that into place. And a car is not something like a house that will stay in the country. A car is more difficult. It can travel from Germany to the Netherlands and then to Norway and vice versa. So that's more difficult to get arranged. But it's not like we already have a EU-wide description of how we do it. And I guess it's not possible because all countries are in different stage of stimulation. So that would mean that we would have to sit on our hands and wait until other countries are coming towards more EVs in the car park, and that's something we cannot afford, I think, because the total amount of CO2 reduction in the Netherlands is quite high. We still have a lot to do.
No, that's all very clear. I suppose outside of fiscal policy, there might be some areas where the used car market across Europe would be incentivized. So Julia and Robin, I think you both mentioned in your introductory comments about ways of speeding up the flow of used BEVs by corporate electrification. And I know that the Commission is looking into this. Some initiative will come this year. So yeah, Julia, maybe start with you. What are kind of the arguments there around speeding up corporate electrification? Is it environmental? Is it social? Is it industrial? What's the idea?
So I know we are running out of time, so I'll be quite brief. We need to accelerate electrification of fleet, and the best way to do it is simply put obligation on those buying those vehicles, for example, leasing companies, large fleet, to purchase them in larger quantities. And because it's such a big demand in the market, it will send a clear signal to manufacturers, such as Owen, to actually say, right, the market is there, we'll produce more of them. That's as simple as that. And doing it at European level creates this level playing field for everybody. We're talking about corporates, right? We're not talking about private people. So it really makes sense to do it at European level. The one thing I do want to add though, and that's around the size of vehicles. I do think that as we do that, and as we accelerate those vehicles, more and more production of them, we should at the same time tackle the right sizing of them. Otherwise, it will be too late and we will have a big problem on our hands. And that's where we have tax. That's where we have industrial policy. So much money today goes to car manufacturers to help them retool and produce electric vehicles. Social leasing in France will be just one of them. Just like in housing, you build a new house and you should normally have 20-30% of your housing as affordable housing. We would like similarly for car manufacturers, when they are given public money to produce more BEVs, to promise and actually put aside at least a third of their production to be in those affordable small and medium segments. And last but not least, a lot we can do at European level to make BEVs more resource efficient. And that's something we'd like to do as part of the next review of vehicle CO2 standards. Thank you.
In 1 minute, Griffin, if I may. I'm looking forward for the new small Volvo to come to the market. Personally, a big fan of the brand, so if I can actually buy one day, that would be great. As Julia mentioned, we need to accelerate. There are tools on the way on Euro 7. It touches topic we just discussed on the state of health. It needs to be standardized. On the vehicle passport, people need to have the right information when they go and buy a car. They need to know what is the state of health. They need to know also, because it's possible today, the actual fuel and electricity consumption of your car when you buy a used electric vehicles. You have the possibility and the right to know now what the actual electricity consumption of this car is, and that's super important information. You need to know the charging habits that the previous owner has and what could be your charging habits. All this information is lacking, and if we provide that information in a clear way, in a clear manner, that will definitely help people down the line.
There's a clear call to action there. Thanks so much, Robin, for sharing that. And thanks so much to all the speakers today. We're going to have to wrap it up. There was so much interest. I was really overwhelmed by the amount of people who have signed up and have stayed throughout the 2-hour session today. But I think we delivered. I certainly learned a lot. So just a couple of reminders. This session has been recorded. It will be posted on TNE's event page. If you want to listen again, share with colleagues. And if you enjoyed it, please sign up to TNE newsletters. I think there'll be more events like this in the future. And yeah, that's it. Of course, check the web pages of the speakers you heard today. Lots of good research being done in this space. And I look forward to continuing these discussions. So with that, thanks for coming. Speak soon.
Bye-bye.